The crisp slide of heavy parchment against a polished mahogany surface carries a distinct, final weight. We sat in the air-conditioned chill of a Tampa law office while the brutal Florida heat pressed uselessly against the tinted glass. My mother, Diane, smoothed the fabric of her designer black skirt. It was a recent purchase, funded by a checking account she assumed she now owned. Beside her, my sister Vanessa and her husband Trent shared a thin, victorious look. Trent leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his ankles. He adjusted his platinum watch while his eyes scanned the room like a developer assessing a plot for demolition. He was already calculating the liquidation value of my grandmother's Sarasota beachfront property. The attorney finished reading the document they had bullied Helen into signing just days before her passing. The terms were stark. The sprawling coastal estate, the investment portfolios, the vintage heirlooms, all passed directly to Vanessa and Trent. I was left a token $50. A precise, calculated insult designed to prevent me from claiming I had simply been forgotten in the paperwork. Diane exhaled a soft, theatrical sigh and placed a hand over her chest. She played the grieving daughter for the attorney, but her posture radiated relief. They all turned to look at me. They expected a fracture. They anticipated tears, a shouted defense, a desperate plea for fairness, or a dramatic exit. They wanted the chaotic reaction that would validate the narrative they had spent over a year building, the story that I was unstable, bitter, and unfit to manage Helen Mason's legacy. I did not move. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I aligned my spine against the back of the chair and held Trent's gaze. I offered nothing. When you refuse to supply the expected panic, the architects of a trap are forced to sit in the uncomfortable silence of their own malice. The attorney cleared his throat and adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses. He set the fraudulent will down and reached into his leather briefcase. However, the attorney said, his voice dropped an octave, shifting the temperature in the room. Mrs. Mason entrusted me with a second envelope, one that supersedes this document entirely. Trent's smirk stalled. His foot dropped to the floor. Diane's hand froze over her heart. The attorney retrieved a thick sealed envelope bearing my name. He slid a silver letter opener under the wax seal. Right as the paper tore, I let myself remember how we built this trap. To understand the silence in this office, you have to understand the 14 months that led to this table. My name is Mia Mason. I'm 31 years old, and I live in Florida. I'm a corporate compliance investigator. My daily existence involves parsing through billing codes, unearthing discrepancies, and identifying the paper trails of corrupt administrators. If you have ever watched entitled people steal what is not theirs and waited for them to trip over their own arrogance, you are in the right place. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance. Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. I do not deal in assumptions. I deal in timestamps and verifiable data. My family made the fatal mistake of assuming my quiet observation was ignorance. The campaign against me started with pebbles, not boulders. 14 months ago, Helen experienced a mild fainting spell in her kitchen. She was shaken but unharmed. Yet Diane and Vanessa immediately treated the incident like a transfer of power. They drove to her primary care physician the next morning. They changed her emergency contact forms and erased my name from the authorized registry. I would arrive for our routine Sunday lunches to find Vanessa already sitting on the lanai. Vanessa would steer the conversation away from anything financial. If Helen tried to mention her bank statements or property taxes, Vanessa would laugh loudly and pat our grandmother's hand. She would remind Helen that her memory was slipping, and she should leave the heavy lifting to Trent. Meanwhile, Diane began whispering to the extended relatives. She planted seeds of doubt during phone calls and holiday gatherings. She told them I was too obsessed with my hospital job to properly care for an aging relative. I absorbed the slights. I recognized the perimeter test. I looked at Helen's trembling hand holding her teacup, and I remembered a childhood lesson at that very same table. Helen had taught me cursive. She told me my signature was my bond, and to never let anyone hold my pen. I stayed quiet. I knew they were building a narrative of my absence to justify their impending control. They thought they were writing me out of the story. They did not know I was auditing the author. 14 months ago, the air in Sarasota hung thick and wet, carrying the suffocating humidity of late July. My grandmother experienced a mild fainting spell near her back patio. It was a brief, terrifying moment caused by dehydration and the brutal afternoon sun. She recovered quickly, sitting up before the paramedics even arrived at her driveway. To any rational family member, it was a warning to encourage better hydration. To Diane and Vanessa, it was the opening bell of a hostile takeover. They did not call me when the ambulance transported Helen to the regional medical center for observation. I found out 3 hours later through a casual text message from a distant cousin who assumed I was already pacing the waiting room. I left my office immediately, navigating the dense coastal traffic with my hands gripping the steering wheel. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital, bypassing the crowded seating area, and approached the main admissions desk. I gave the clerk Helen's name and asked for her room number. The clerk typed the information into her keyboard, her eyes scanning the digital intake forms. She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. She asked for my identification. I handed her my driver's license. The clerk looked at the plastic card, then back at her screen, offering a tight, apologetic wince. She informed me that my name was no longer listed on the authorized visitor registry or the emergency contact sheet. She explained that Helen's daughter Diane had arrived an hour earlier and requested a comprehensive update to the medical proxy files. Diane had designated herself as the primary contact and Vanessa as the secondary. I was erased. I stood at the polished laminate counter of the admissions desk. I did not raise my voice at the clerk. The clerk was merely a custodian of the paperwork, and I do not shoot messengers. I absorbed the reality of the situation. Changing an emergency contact form while a patient is undergoing medical observation is not a careless oversight. It is a calculated structural shift. It is the drawing of a new perimeter. I took my license back. I walked down the sterile white hallway toward the observation wing. I found Diane and Vanessa hovering near Helen's bed. They were performing their roles with practiced theatricality. Diane was fluffing a pillow Helen did not need adjusted. Vanessa was speaking in a slow, exaggerated register, the kind of patronizing baby talk usually reserved for toddlers. They looked up when I entered the room. They did not exhibit guilt. They exhibited the smug, proprietary glow of scavengers claiming a fresh territory. Diane offered a thin smile, asking how I managed to pull myself away from my little hospital job. My job is not little. I am a corporate compliance investigator for a regional healthcare network spanning 5 counties. I spend my days tracing phantom billing codes, auditing fraudulent expense reports, and finding the exact locations where greedy executives bury their stolen capital. I possess the security clearance to dismantle a hospital administrator's career with a single keystroke. Diane knew this. She intentionally diminished my profession to validate her own narrative. She began whispering to the extended family that very same week. She planted seeds of doubt during phone calls and casual coffee dates. She told our aunts and cousins that I was too obsessed with my career to properly care for an aging relative. She painted a picture of a cold, ambitious granddaughter who abandoned her family for corporate climbing. I heard the rumors echo back to me. I received the judgmental glances at family gatherings. I did not engage. Defending yourself against a whisper campaign only makes you look guilty of the accusation. I knew what they were doing. They were constructing a social alibi. They were building a narrative of my absence so that when they finally seized total control, the extended family would view it as a necessary rescue rather than a premeditated theft. The microaggressions bled into our routine Sunday lunches. Helen owned a sprawling beachfront property in Sarasota, a pristine piece of real estate my grandfather had purchased decades ago before the coastal market exploded. The house smelled of salt spray and old cedar. It was my sanctuary. I would arrive for our Sunday meals to find Vanessa already sitting on the lanai overlooking the Gulf of Mexico. Vanessa would wear expensive designer sundresses she could not afford, sipping iced tea and acting as the gatekeeper to our grandmother. The psychological warfare was relentless. If Helen tried to bring up her property taxes or asked a question about a recent bank statement she received in the mail, Vanessa would intercept the conversation. Vanessa would laugh loudly, reaching across the patio table to pat Helen's hand. "Oh, Grandma," Vanessa would say, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You are slipping again. We paid that property tax bill weeks ago. Do not stress your fragile heart over these tedious numbers. Let Trent handle the heavy lifting from now on. Your memory is just not what it used to be." Helen would blink, a flash of genuine confusion crossing her features. The bank envelope would remain unopened on the glass table. Vanessa would quickly steer the topic toward mundane gossip, effectively silencing the matriarch in her own home. I sat across the table watching the gaslighting unfold in real time. I saw the way Helen looked down at her lap. I saw the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted her porcelain teacup. That tremor was not a symptom of cognitive decline. It was the physical manifestation of a proud woman realizing her autonomy was being stripped away piece by piece. I looked at her trembling fingers gripping the delicate handle of the cup, and the image triggered a profound memory. I was 9 years old, sitting at the same kitchen table inside that Sarasota house. The air smelled of lemon polish and baking bread. Helen sat beside me, holding a fountain pen. She was teaching me how to write in cursive. She guided my hand across the lined paper, teaching me the loops and sharp angles of my own name. She told me that a person's word was their currency, but their signature was their lock. I remember her setting the pen down on the wood. She looked me directly in the eye, her gaze fierce and uncompromising. "Your signature is your bond, Mia," she had said. "It is the only thing in this world that truly belongs to you. Never let anyone hold your pen." The memory faded, replaced by the harsh afternoon sunlight glaring off the Gulf. The fierce woman who taught me to protect my name was now sitting across from me, being convinced by her own granddaughter that her mind was failing. I stayed quiet. I sipped my tea and listened to Vanessa rattle on about a new country club membership. I did not throw my drink. I did not launch into a screaming match on the lanai. Confronting a narcissist without a locked trap only invites a louder lie. If I accused Vanessa of manipulation, Diane would immediately use the outburst as proof of my supposed instability. They would ban me from the property entirely. I recognized the pebbles for what they were. They were testing the structural integrity of Helen's independence. They were eroding her confidence to make her compliant. But as I drove back to my apartment that evening, my analytical training took over. Why the sudden urgency? Diane had always been greedy, and Vanessa had always been cruel, but they were lazy. Orchestrating a medical proxy takeover and running a sustained gaslighting campaign required active, relentless effort. Lazy people do not perform hard labor unless there is a fire burning right behind them. I needed to look at the perimeter they were defending. The answer was not sitting on the lanai. The answer was parked in the driveway. Trent projected the image of a thriving commercial developer. He drove a leased luxury SUV, wore custom-tailored suits, and spoke loudly about his vast portfolio. But as a compliance investigator, I know that loud men wearing expensive suits are usually trying to distract you from their balance sheets. Trent was the catalyst. His shiny exterior was beginning to crack, and the urgency to control Helen's estate was directly tied to the impending collapse of his own financial illusions. The pebbles were about to become a landslide. Trent wore bespoke Italian wool and drove a vehicle that cost more than my annual salary. He projected the image of a titan. But in the world of commercial real estate, a pristine exterior usually hides a rotting foundation. I spent my lunch breaks running discreet inquiries into his Orlando portfolio. The public records painted a grim picture. His luxury condominium project was stalled. Subcontractors were filing mechanics liens for unpaid invoices. The bank was threatening foreclosure on his primary commercial loan. He was not a thriving developer. He was a desperate man wearing a very expensive disguise. He needed a cash injection, and my grandmother's coastal estate was the closest viable target. The opportunity he needed arrived in early September. Helen required a minor outpatient procedure to remove a benign growth on her shoulder. It was a routine operation requiring only a mild sedative and a brief recovery period. I planned to take the afternoon off to drive her home. Diane intervened. She called me the night before, her tone clipped and authoritative. She insisted she and Trent would handle the logistics, claiming my hospital job was far too important to disrupt. I knew better than to argue over a car ride, assuming I would simply visit the house that evening to check on her. By the time I arrived at the Sarasota property, the locks on the financial vault had already been changed. I found Helen sitting in her favorite armchair, looking pale and unusually quiet. Diane and Trent were in the kitchen pouring celebratory glasses of wine. They possessed the electric humming energy of thieves who had just pulled off a successful heist. I asked Helen how the procedure went. She did not answer the medical question. Instead, she pointed a trembling finger toward a stack of legal documents resting on the coffee table. The top sheet bore the seal of a local notary. It was a durable power of attorney. The clauses were exhaustive. It granted Trent and Diane total, unmitigated control over Helen's financial accounts, real estate holdings, and medical decisions. The signature at the bottom was shaky, the ink was smudged, but it belonged to my grandmother. I felt a cold knot form in my chest. I looked at the woman who had taught me to guard my signature with my life. I knelt beside her chair, keeping my voice low so the kitchen audience could not hear. I asked her why she surrendered her pen. Helen looked toward the hallway, ensuring we were alone. Her eyes were not clouded with dementia. They were sharp with terror. She explained the ambush. As she was waking up from the anesthesia, still disoriented and vulnerable, Diane and Trent entered the recovery room. They did not bring flowers. They brought a clipboard. They framed the power of attorney as a temporary administrative necessity. They called it a simple form to help pay a few medical bills while she rested. When Helen hesitated, the polite facade vanished. Trent leaned over the bed and delivered the ultimatum. He told her that if she refused to sign, they would petition the court for full legal guardianship. They would testify that her memory was failing, utilizing the fabricated medical concerns Diane had been cultivating for months. They promised to declare her legally incompetent and force her into a state-managed nursing facility by the end of the week. It was not a legal agreement. It was an extortion tactic. Helen signed the document because handing over her checkbook was the only way to avoid dying in a sterile, linoleum-floored institution. She traded her wealth to keep her freedom. She was a hostage in her own home. I squeezed her hand, promising her I would find a way to dismantle the trap. The ink on the durable power of attorney barely had time to dry before the asset bleed commenced. Lazy thieves grabbed the silver on the way out the door, but corporate scavengers operate with methodical precision. They started small, testing the waters to see if anyone was monitoring the accounts. I noticed the physical absences first. Helen possessed a vintage diamond brooch. It was a gift from my grandfather on their 30th wedding anniversary. She kept it in a velvet-lined drawer on her vanity. 2 weeks after the hospital ambush, the drawer was empty. When I casually asked Vanessa if she had seen the heirloom, she offered a dismissive wave of her hand. She claimed Helen had probably misplaced it during one of her confused episodes. I knew Helen had not misplaced it. The brooch was currently sitting in a pawn shop or a jeweler's safe, converted into liquid cash to cover a missed payment on Trent's luxury vehicle. The theft rapidly escalated from jewelry to institutional capital. As a compliance investigator, I know how to read the subtle shifts in a financial portfolio. I monitored the mail arriving at the Sarasota house. The quarterly statements from Helen's brokerage firm showed alarming activity. 2 low-yield mutual funds, stable investments, designed to generate conservative retirement income, were abruptly liquidated. The official reason listed on the transaction receipt cited future care costs. Future care costs for a woman who owned her home outright and possessed premium health insurance. The funds were not paying for medical care. They were being siphoned directly into Trent's failing Orlando enterprise. He was using his wife's grandmother as a personal slush fund, plugging the gaping holes in his balance sheet with the legacy my grandfather spent a lifetime building. Diane and Trent were acting with unchecked impunity. They believed the power of attorney provided them an impenetrable shield against any accusations of theft. They assumed I was just a powerless granddaughter watching from the sidelines, incapable of stopping the hemorrhage. They grew comfortable. And when arrogant people grow comfortable, they make mistakes. They stop covering their tracks. I was cataloging the liquidated mutual funds and the missing jewelry, waiting for them to take a step too far. I was compiling a silent ledger of their crimes, knowing that confronting them now would only result in Helen being moved to a facility to sever my access. I had to let them steal, so I could map the destination of the funds. But the true scope of Trent's desperation did not reveal itself in the slow drain of conservative investments. It revealed itself on a random Tuesday when a much larger, far more dangerous sum of money simply vanished into the dark, pointing toward a threat that had nothing to do with real estate development. Tuesday mornings in the compliance department usually involve parsing routine Medicare discrepancies and reviewing vendor invoices for the regional hospital network. The work requires a steady rhythm and an eye for the spaces where numbers fail to align. But on this particular Tuesday, my secondary monitor was not dedicated to hospital administration. It was dedicated to my grandmother. Months prior, long before Diane and Trent cornered Helen in that recovery room, I had established a secure, read-only portal linked to Helen's primary checking account. It was a digital safety net designed to monitor her automated bill payments and ensure her property taxes were processed without delay. Diane and Trent did not know this portal existed. They assumed their newly minted power of attorney granted them exclusive dominion over the financial landscape. They were ignorant of the silent watchtower I had constructed in the background. At 10:14 in the morning, a notification flashed across the upper right corner of my screen. The digital alert disrupted the quiet equilibrium of my office. It was a single automated clearinghouse withdrawal. The amount was $50,000. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A profound clinical coldness settled into my chest. $50,000 is not a misplaced vintage brooch or a subtle adjustment to a mutual fund. It is a severe structural hemorrhage. It is the threshold where localized theft graduates into serious capital flight. When an amount that large moves without warning, the entire financial architecture of an estate is in jeopardy. Panic is a useless emotion in an audit, but internal doubt is a powerful motivator. I stared at the transaction receipt and assumed the worst possible scenario. I assumed Trent had finally established an offshore holding company. Corporate scavengers often utilize foreign registries to shield stolen assets from domestic legal scrutiny. Once liquid capital crosses international waters into jurisdictions with strict banking secrecy laws, recovering the funds becomes a logistical nightmare. If he was moving $50,000 today, he would move $500,000 tomorrow. Helen's estate would evaporate into a digital ghost town, leaving us with nothing but worthless paper and empty accounts. The money might be gone forever. I closed my active hospital case files. I diverted my full professional attention to the unauthorized withdrawal. Tracing a wire transfer is akin to pulling a single thread from a tangled garment. You must follow the tension without breaking the line. I opened the transaction metadata. The details were deliberately vague. The memo line read, "Consulting retainer." It was a classic corporate obfuscation tactic. Lazy thieves utilized generic descriptions to bypass automated banking filters. Trent was trying to disguise a massive cash extraction as a routine business expense. I isolated the receiving routing number. I ran the digits through a secure financial database we use to flag suspicious medical vendors. I waited for the geographical location to populate on my screen. I braced myself to see a registry in Switzerland or a corporate mail drop in the Cayman Islands. The results appeared. The red herring dissolved into an entirely different kind of terror. The money did not travel across international borders. It did not route through an impenetrable offshore clearinghouse. It went south. It traveled 3 hours down the Florida coast and landed in a regional bank branch in Miami. I highlighted the receiving entity. The account belonged to a limited liability company with an aggressively generic name, Apex Capital Solutions. I opened a new browser window and pulled the state corporate registry. Legitimate consulting firms operate out of downtown high-rises and possess verifiable digital footprints. Apex Capital Solutions possessed neither. The principal address listed on the incorporation documents was not a corporate plaza. It was a commercial mail drop located inside a dilapidated strip mall in Hialeah. The discrepancy was glaring. A thriving real estate developer wearing custom Italian wool does not retain consultants operating out of suburban strip malls. I cross-referenced the name of the managing partner listed on the LLC documents with the state court dockets. The search results populated an extensive and terrifying history. The managing partner had zero background in corporate consulting or real estate development. His legal history consisted of multiple civil suits alleging predatory lending practices. There were restraining orders filed by former business associates. There were documented allegations of extortion and physical intimidation. Apex Capital Solutions was not an investment group. It was a high-interest private lender. It was a localized loan shark operating just inside the gray margins of the law. The realization shifted the entire landscape of the conflict. I sat back in my office chair and processed the severity of Trent's situation. My brother-in-law was not hoarding cash for a luxurious early retirement. He was paying blood money. He was emptying my grandmother's accounts to keep men with bad intentions away from his front door. The bespoke suits, the least luxury vehicle, the booming confidence at Sunday dinners, all of it was a fragile costume. Beneath the expensive fabric, Trent was drowning in toxic debt. He had clearly exhausted his lines of credit with traditional banking institutions. Legitimate banks require collateral and transparent ledgers. Trent possessed neither. In a desperate bid to maintain the affluent illusion, he had turned to dangerous people for capital. A greedy man is calculating. He weighs risk against reward. He steals only what he believes he can justify or hide. But a desperate man, facing imminent physical threats, does not perform risk assessment. He simply survives. Trent was no longer operating out of mere entitlement. He was a cornered animal. A cornered animal is erratic and inherently lethal. Trent would burn my grandmother's entire legacy to ash just to buy himself another month of breathing room. The $50,000 was a temporary bandage on a severed artery. Those types of lenders charge exorbitant interest rates. The balance would compound rapidly. Trent would need more capital soon. He would need a lot more. The slow drain of mutual funds and pawned jewelry would no longer satisfy the creditors in Miami. He needed a massive injection of untethered equity. He needed to liquidate the largest asset in Helen's portfolio. He needed the Sarasota beachfront property. But liquidating real estate is a prolonged process. Even with a durable power of attorney, selling a house requires appraisals, title searches, and transparent escrow accounts. A sudden sale, initiated by a son-in-law, would raise immediate red flags with the county authorities and the title insurers, especially if the primary owner was still residing in the home. Trent needed to streamline the theft. He needed to remove Helen from the property and establish a flawless legal premise for the sale. I had to anticipate his next maneuver before he executed it. I needed to look for the groundwork. I turned my attention away from the bank ledgers and focused on the broader administrative footprint of the estate. I began reviewing every single document I could access. I started with Helen's recent medical billing records. I wanted to see if Diane and Trent were scheduling specialized neurological consultations or requesting aggressive psychiatric evaluations. I needed to know if they were laying the medical groundwork to place Helen in a specialized long-term care facility. If they successfully committed her under the guise of cognitive decline, they could easily justify selling the beachfront house to fund her medical expenses. It was the perfect alibi. The proceeds from the sale would flow into an account they controlled, allowing Trent to pay off his dangerous creditors while appearing to be a devoted caregiver. I parsed through the medical invoices, looking for anomalies. I found nothing unusual. The billing codes reflected only routine checkups and the recent minor shoulder procedure. They were not utilizing the medical route yet. If they were not using the hospital system to justify the sale, they had to be using a different legal mechanism. I logged into the county property appraiser's public database to check the current status of the Sarasota estate. I wanted to ensure the deed remained unencumbered by sudden liens or unauthorized lines of credit. I typed Helen's legal name into the search bar. The system processed the query. The results populated on my screen in neat, organized rows. But it was not the Sarasota beachfront property that caught my attention. A stark red flag appeared next to a different parcel in the portfolio. It was a vacant commercial lot Helen owned in Clearwater, a piece of land she had held for over 2 decades. And right beside that localized flag, embedded in the official county registry, was a name I never expected to see attached to a fraudulent transfer. It was my own name. The pixels on my secondary monitor seemed to freeze, locking my own name into the county property registry. Mia Mason. The letters sat there stark and undeniable, attached to a parcel of commercial real estate I did not own. In the compliance department, we are trained to recognize the physical symptoms of a targeted attack. Your vision narrows. The ambient noise of the office, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant chatter of colleagues, all of it recedes into a flat drone. My heart did not race. It simply stopped for a long, suspended second. I reached for my mouse. My hand hovered over the plastic, steady and deliberate. I clicked the hyperlink associated with the localized flag. The county database initiated a download. A scanned portable document format materialized on my screen, bearing the official watermark of the Florida Recording Office. It was a quitclaim deed. I read the text of the legal instrument, line by line. The document executed the transfer of a vacant commercial lot located in Clearwater. Helen and my grandfather had purchased that specific parcel over 2 decades ago. It was prime, unencumbered coastal real estate holding significant market value. According to the deed, Helen was relinquishing her entire ownership stake in the property for the sum of $10. A $10 transfer is a classic wash transaction, a mechanism frequently utilized in estate planning to shift assets between family members without triggering immediate tax liabilities. But this transfer was not an estate planning maneuver. The receiving entity, the grantee listed on the second page, was not a family trust. It was a limited liability company called Clearwater Coastal Holdings. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the state corporate registry. I typed the name of the holding company into the search bar. The articles of organization populated the screen. The company had been formed just 3 weeks prior, coinciding perfectly with the timeline of Trent's escalating financial desperation. I scrolled down to the management structure. The registered agent was a generic commercial mail drop located in a strip mall near Orlando. The managing member, the individual possessing total executive control over the entity and its assets, was listed in plain text, Mia Mason. The architecture of the crime revealed itself with breathtaking clarity. Trent was not merely siphoning mutual funds and pawning vintage brooches to appease his private lenders in Miami. Those thefts were desperate, disorganized grabs for immediate liquidity. This deed represented a calculated structural escalation. Trent was orchestrating a massive capital extraction, and he was building a scapegoat to absorb the fallout. I navigated back to the scanned quitclaim deed. I scrolled to the final page, the section designated for signatures and official notarization. I needed to see how they executed the illusion. There, resting on the line just above the embossed state seal, was my signature. It was not a clumsy trace or a shaky imitation. It was a practiced, fluid execution of the exact cursive loops and sharp angles Helen had taught me at her kitchen table when I was 9 years old. The slant of the M, the precise crossing of the T, the specific pressure of the pen stroke, all of it was replicated with chilling accuracy. I stared at the forgery. A profound, icy dread pooled in my stomach. The theft of the property was a severe blow to Helen's legacy, but the theft of my identity was a lethal threat to my freedom. If Trent sold or leveraged the Clearwater lot, the proceeds would flow directly into accounts associated with Clearwater Coastal Holdings. He could then drain those accounts to pay off his toxic debt. When the money inevitably vanished, and the estate was subjected to a routine probate audit, the paper trail would end abruptly at a corporate entity managed by the matriarch's own granddaughter. I evaluated the scenario through the lens of a federal prosecutor. The narrative would appear flawlessly damning. A corporate compliance investigator, a woman possessing intimate knowledge of complex financial systems and banking regulations, utilizes her professional expertise to swindle her vulnerable grandmother out of prime commercial real estate. Trent would step forward as the aggrieved, protective son-in-law. He would present the durable power of attorney as evidence of his authorized stewardship. Diane and Vanessa would testify to my emotional detachment. They would recount the social smear campaign they had spent months cultivating. They would tell the authorities how I was obsessed with my career, how I rarely visited, and how I had grown cold and calculating. They were not just stealing an asset, they were framing me for felony elder abuse. A conviction of that magnitude carries a sentence of 10 to 15 years in a state penitentiary. It mandates the permanent revocation of all professional auditing licenses. It guarantees total societal ruin. Trent intended to feed me to the criminal justice system so he could walk away from his own insolvency clean and unburdened. The instinct to panic, to pick up my phone and scream at my sister surged upward. It is a primal urge to confront the architect of your destruction. I forced the urge down. I swallowed it, letting the clinical detachment of my profession override the terror. Screaming is a luxury reserved for people who hold the leverage. If I called Trent and accused him of forgery, I would simply alert him that his trap had been discovered. He would immediately destroy the supporting documentation, liquidate the Clearwater parcel at a steep discount, and finalize the frame job before I could gather counter evidence. I needed to remain a ghost in my own life. I needed to let him believe the illusion was secure, while I dismantled the foundation. I refocused my attention on the forged document. A flawless signature is impressive, but a signature alone does not legitimize a real estate transfer. A legal deed requires an independent witness. It requires the stamp of a licensed notary public who swears, under penalty of perjury, that they verified the identity of the signatory. I zoomed in on the bottom corner of the page. I examined the circular stamp pressed into the paper. It contained the name of the notary, their commission number, and the expiration date of their state license. That stamp was the weak point in Trent's armor. It was the loose thread I needed to pull. But as I documented the notary information, a darker, far more devastating realization paralyzed my hands. Forging a signature on a piece of paper is a matter of practice. Establishing a limited liability company with the state and opening the associated commercial bank accounts is a matter of strict regulatory compliance. Financial institutions enforce rigid identification protocols to prevent international money laundering. You cannot form a corporate entity without submitting primary identification. The state registry requires a verifiable Social Security number. The banks require historical tax data, a government-issued identification card, and proof of residence. Trent did not possess my Social Security number. He did not have access to my historical tax returns. He had never been inside my apartment to intercept my mail. There was only one place on earth where those specific childhood documents were archived. They resided inside a heavy, fireproof safe hidden beneath a stack of winter coats in a garage located in Tampa. My mother held the combination to that safe. The air in my office grew thin. The hum of the computer fan sounded distant. Trent was the desperate animal driving the theft, but he could not have built the cage without a willing accomplice providing the materials. Diane had not merely watched her son-in-law orchestrate my ruin. She had supplied the ammunition. My own mother had actively participated in stealing my identity, sacrificing her daughter's freedom to preserve the fragile, affluent facade of her country club lifestyle. The perimeter of the war expanded instantly. I was no longer fighting a greedy brother-in-law. I was fighting a family syndicate willing to consume its own offspring for capital. I saved the quitclaim deed to my secure, encrypted drive. I logged out of the county database. The time for observation had officially expired. The investigation had to move underground, and the first target was the name stamped at the bottom of that fraudulent deed. The transition from paralyzing shock to calculated action is a subtle biological shift. In the compliance department, we are trained to compartmentalize trauma. When you uncover a severed artery in a financial ledger, panic is a useless indulgence. You do not scream, you apply a tourniquet. I sat in my sterile office, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and systematically locked my emotions away in a dark mental vault. The war had to move underground. Screaming accusations at my mother or my brother-in-law would only alert them to the breach. I needed to let them believe their illusion was impenetrable while I quietly dismantled the foundational pillars of their theft. I turned my attention back to the forged quitclaim deed displayed on my secondary monitor. A flawless cursive signature is a compelling piece of theater. But the true legal weight of any property transfer rests entirely on the independent witness. The state requires a licensed notary public to verify the identity of the signatory, under penalty of perjury. I zoomed in on the circular black stamp pressed into the bottom corner of the document. I transcribed the commission number and the printed name. I opened a secure portal linked to the Florida Division of Corporations. The state maintains a rigorous, publicly accessible database of all commissioned notaries. I typed the alphanumeric sequence into the search parameters and executed the query. The system processed the request, retrieving the historical data associated with that specific seal. The name populated on my screen: Sarah Jenkins. I cross-referenced her identity through a standard background verification tool we utilize for hospital vendors. The results yielded a former employment record that immediately clarified the mechanics of the forgery. Sarah Jenkins was not an independent legal contractor. She was a former administrative assistant who had worked directly for Trent's commercial real estate firm in Orlando. But the employment history was not the fatal flaw in Trent's design. The critical vulnerability resided in the commission status listed on the state registry. Sarah Jenkins had been terminated from the firm 3 years prior. Her official state notary commission had expired 24 months ago. I stared at the expiration date. A profound, icy satisfaction replaced the lingering dread in my stomach. Arrogance is the ultimate vulnerability of corrupt men. Trent was accustomed to operating in an environment where he dictated the rules. He possessed a fundamental disdain for administrative details, viewing legal compliance as a tedious obstacle meant only for the working class. He had likely kept his former assistant's physical stamp locked in a desk drawer after her departure, assuming he could utilize it whenever a convenient shortcut was required. He believed paperwork was merely a formality. He assumed no one would ever look closely enough at the fine print to notice the discrepancy. He was wrong. Utilizing an expired notary seal to execute a fraudulent property transfer is not a simple clerical error. It is a severe, systemic violation of state law. The quitclaim deed was legally void the moment the ink touched the page. Trent had handed me the exact mechanism of his own destruction, bundled neatly in a careless, sloppy oversight. However, invalidating the deed was only half the battle. The creation of Clearwater Coastal Holdings, the shell company designed to receive the stolen property, presented a far more complex threat. Forging a signature on a piece of paper requires only a pen and practice. Establishing a functional limited liability company and opening the associated commercial bank accounts requires navigating stringent federal regulations. The banking industry operates under strict Know Your Customer protocols. To open a corporate account, financial institutions demand verifiable primary identification. They require a social security number, historical residential data, and proof of identity. Trent could not simply invent these credentials. He needed the authentic source materials. I logged into my personal secure terminal and pulled my own comprehensive credit reports from the primary bureaus. I scrutinized the recent inquiry logs. A hard credit pull had been executed 3 weeks prior by a regional commercial bank based in Tampa. The inquiry aligned perfectly with the incorporation date of the fraudulent LLC. I needed to trace the digital origin of the application. Utilizing my compliance clearance, I accessed the metadata embedded in the electronic articles of organization filed with the state registry. Every digital submission carries an invisible footprint. I isolated the originating Internet Protocol address responsible for transmitting the LLC formation documents. I ran a geolocation trace on the numerical sequence. The signal did not originate from Trent's corporate office in Orlando. It did not bounce through an anonymous offshore proxy server. The address resolved to a static residential internet service provider located in a specific affluent zip code in Tampa. The address belonged to the house where I grew up. It was my mother's router. I closed my eyes. The sterile environment of my office faded, replaced by the vivid memory of the humid, cluttered garage attached to my childhood home. Tucked away in the back corner, hidden beneath a stack of heavy winter coats and holiday decorations, sat a heavy, fireproof sentry safe. Diane guarded the combination to that vault with fierce territoriality. Inside that steel box resided the foundational documents of our family: birth certificates, passports, and the early tax returns from my college jobs. My mother had walked into that garage. She had spun the combination dial, opened the heavy door, extracted my Social Security card and my historical tax documents, and handed them directly to a desperate real estate developer. The motive was not a mystery. It was written in the designer labels she wore and the country club fees she paid. Diane prioritized the illusion of wealth above all other earthly concerns. Trent's impending bankruptcy threatened to shatter the affluent facade she had spent decades cultivating. If Trent lost his Orlando properties, Vanessa would lose her luxury vehicles, and Diane would lose her status as the matriarch of a thriving dynasty. She could not stomach the prospect of being pitied by the other wives at the tennis club. To preserve her standing, she evaluated the assets at her disposal and made a chilling calculation. She decided that my freedom, my professional career, and my future were acceptable collateral damage. She sold her own daughter to fund her mimosas and her pristine social reputation. I opened my eyes. The hurt was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical resolve. I stood up from my desk and walked down the hallway to the secure supply closet. I requisitioned a heavy-duty 3-ring binder. I returned to my office and initiated the printing sequence. I printed the state registry pages proving the notary commission had expired 2 years prior. I printed the geolocation data linking the fraudulent LLC formation directly to Diane's residential internet network. I printed the credit inquiry alerts detailing the unauthorized commercial bank accounts opened in my name. I printed the internal medical billing audits proving Helen was not receiving the specialized neurological care they claimed justified their power of attorney. I took a stack of clear plastic protective sleeves from my drawer. I slid each piece of physical evidence into a sleeve, snapping them into the metal rings of the binder. I was compiling a forensic guillotine. Every page represented an undeniable time-stamped fact that no amount of country club gossip could refute. I closed the heavy cover of the binder. The weapon was assembled. The paper trail was secure. I possessed the leverage required to send Trent to a federal penitentiary and expose Diane as a willing accomplice to identity theft. But launching the counteroffensive immediately would be a tactical error. Helen was still vulnerable, residing in the Sarasota house under the shadow of their power of attorney. If I triggered the trap now, they would simply accelerate their efforts to declare her legally incompetent and lock her away in a state facility to punish me. I needed to secure the matriarch before I burned the kingdom down. While I was operating in the digital shadows, Vanessa was accelerating her efforts in the sunlight. The social war was escalating rapidly. My phone vibrated on the desk. An electronic invitation materialized on the screen. Vanessa was hosting an exclusive brunch at her country club the following morning. The guest list included the most influential voices in their social circle. I knew the purpose of the gathering. It was a calculated theater production designed to solidify the narrative of my emotional instability and cement her role as the devoted, suffering caregiver. I stared at the digital invitation. I knew I had to attend. I would have to walk into a room filled with people who were actively cheering for my destruction, sit across from the sister trying to frame me for a felony, and offer them nothing but a polite, impenetrable smile. The hammer drop was coming, but the stage required further preparation. The Tampa Country Club possessed the kind of manicured perfection that requires a small army to maintain. I handed my keys to a valet beneath a sprawling portico, my shoes clicking against the pristine cobblestone. The air smelled of expensive jasmine perfume and freshly cut Bermuda grass. It was a Tuesday morning, a time when most people are navigating the demands of their employment. Here, Tuesday morning was reserved for curated leisure. I walked through the double glass doors, my mind automatically calculating the overhead of the environment. In my profession, you cannot look at opulence without wondering who is funding the deficit. I knew exactly who was funding this particular gathering. The hostess directed me to a private dining room overlooking the 18th hole. I stepped through the archway and surveyed the spectacle. A mimosa bar occupied one corner, flanked by imported orchids. Custom-printed menu cards rested on gold charger plates. It was a lavish presentation. I did not admire the aesthetics. I recognized the transaction. This brunch was not paid for by Trent's real estate acumen or Vanessa's non-existent salary. It was financed by a recent unauthorized withdrawal I had tracked from Helen's secondary checking account. I was attending a party funded by my grandmother's stolen security. Vanessa sat at the center of a long circular table surrounded by 6 women. These women were the arbiters of local society. They controlled the charity boards, the school committees, and the country club whisper network. Vanessa had not gathered friends for a casual meal. She had assembled a jury. I approached the table. Vanessa looked up, her expression morphing instantly into a mask of tragic relief. She stood and offered a delicate, fragrant embrace that involved 0 actual physical contact. "Mia," she sighed, her voice pitched perfectly to ensure the entire room heard the greeting. "I am so glad you could step away from your work. We rarely see you anymore." I offered a polite greeting to the assembled guests and took the only available seat positioned directly across from my sister. I ordered a glass of sparkling water. I did not touch the champagne. I treated the brunch like a hostile deposition. You keep your mind clear and your hands visible. The opening course arrived. Vanessa initiated her performance. She wore a pastel linen dress projecting an aura of exhausted elegance. She was playing the martyr, a role she had refined over the last few months. She spoke in hushed, breathy tones about the toll caregiving was taking on her spirit. She described Helen's supposed cognitive decline with fabricated sorrow. She told the table about late-night phone calls and confused wanderings. She painted a picture of an elderly woman losing her grip on reality, requiring constant, vigilant supervision. She claimed Trent was sacrificing his own demanding schedule to help manage the medical appointments. I sat across the table cutting a piece of roasted asparagus and listened to the perjury. Helen was not wandering the halls at night. Helen was a sharp, fiercely independent woman trapped in a house governed by a fraudulent power of attorney. But the women at the table did not know the truth. They leaned in their faces, arranged into masks of practiced sympathy. They murmured their support. They validated Vanessa's sacrifice, telling her how brave she was for carrying such a heavy burden. Vanessa soaked up the validation. She was balancing her social ledger, ensuring these influential women viewed her as a saint. But establishing her own sainthood was only half the strategy. She needed to solidify my villainy. Vanessa shifted the spotlight. She looked across the floral centerpiece directly at me. The sympathy in her eyes transformed into a weapon. She sighed again, a delicate fluttering sound meant to convey deep maternal concern. "It is just so hard to shoulder the responsibility alone," Vanessa murmured, addressing the table while keeping her gaze fixed on my face. "Mia is so devoted to her job at the hospital. She works such grueling hours. We understand she cannot be there for Grandma. Her career has always been her primary focus." The trap was elegantly laid. She framed my profession not as an accomplishment, but as a selfish obsession. She painted me as the cold, ambitious sister who abandoned her ailing family to chase corporate promotions. The affluent wives turned their attention toward me. The sympathy vanished from their features, replaced by a subtle, unified judgment. They looked at my simple gray suit and my unstyled hair. They silently convicted me of negligence. I did not grip my water glass tighter. I did not let my breathing shallow. I maintained a relaxed, open posture. I met the judgment of 6 powerful women with serene indifference. Defending myself would require engaging with the premise of the insult. If I listed the hours I spent auditing Helen's accounts or mentioned the times Vanessa had actively blocked me from visiting the Sarasota house, I would sound defensive. I would sound bitter. I would play the exact character Vanessa was attempting to cast. I smiled, a gentle, unbothered smile. I told the table that dedicated caregiving is indeed a complex logistical challenge, and I was grateful Vanessa had the abundant free time to manage it. A flicker of irritation crossed Vanessa's eyes. The lack of a defensive outburst denied her the immediate climax she desired. She needed me to snap. She needed me to prove I was unstable. Since the emotional bait failed, she pivoted to the structural trap. Vanessa needed more than just painting me as an absent relative. She needed to establish a motive for the crime she and Trent were currently engineering. She needed these specific women to remember a defining detail about my character that aligned perfectly with the forged quitclaim deed sitting in the county registry. Vanessa leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands. Her voice grew loud enough to silence the ambient chatter of the dining room. "Mia, I noticed your sedan when you pulled up to the valet," Vanessa said. "You still have that terrible dent on the rear bumper, and the tires look awfully worn." I looked at her, tracking the trajectory of the conversation. I drove a practical, reliable vehicle. It possessed a minor cosmetic scratch from a parking garage. It was not a sign of distress. It was a sign of utility. Vanessa reached into her designer handbag. She retrieved a leather-bound checkbook and a silver pen. She placed them on the table, a highly visible gesture of financial superiority. "I know things are tight for you right now," Vanessa continued, her tone dripping with toxic pity. "The economy is difficult, and hospital wages only stretch so far. Let me write you a check. Consider it a loan. You can pay me back whenever you get back on your feet. I just worry about you driving an unsafe vehicle." The air in the room stood still. The architecture of the lie revealed itself in stunning high definition. It was a brilliant, wicked maneuver. When Trent eventually liquidated the Clearwater commercial lot and the authorities inevitably investigated the fraudulent LLC registered in my name, these 6 influential women would gladly testify. They would tell the investigators that they witnessed my financial desperation firsthand. They would recount how I drove a damaged car and how my wealthy sister offered me a loan to stay afloat. They would serve as unimpeachable character witnesses for the prosecution, confirming that I possessed the exact motive required to swindle my own grandmother out of prime real estate. Vanessa was not offering to fix a bumper. She was laying the evidentiary groundwork for my federal indictment. The checkbook sat on the white tablecloth, an open invitation to validate her narrative. The wives watched me, waiting for the humiliated, struggling sister to accept the charity. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the woman who shared my blood and was actively trying to destroy my freedom. I did not throw my glass of water in her face. I did not flip the table or scream about the stolen identity documents locked in my office safe. I utilized the lethal calm that terrifies people who rely on noise. I reached out and gently pushed the checkbook back across the table toward her. I maintained unbroken eye contact. I offered a warm, bright smile. "That is incredibly generous of you, Vanessa," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "But my finances are in pristine order. My vehicle is perfectly safe. You should keep your capital accessible. Given the volatile nature of the real estate market lately, Trent might need that liquidity much sooner than I will." I watched the color drain from her face. The casual mention of Trent's vulnerable market position struck the hidden nerve. She knew I knew. The wives looked confused by the sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure. The seed of my supposed desperation had been planted, but the harvest was ruined by my refusal to water it with my anger. I stood up from the table. I placed a crisp $50 bill on the table to cover my sparkling water, refusing to consume a single drop of my grandmother's stolen funds. I thanked the women for their time, wished Vanessa a lovely afternoon, and walked out of the private dining room. I navigated the sprawling lobby and stepped back out into the Florida heat. The valet brought my car. I tipped him, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The quiet of the cabin surrounded me. The social smear was fully operational. Trent had the forged deed. Diane had provided the stolen identity. Vanessa was curating the public motive. They were closing the net from every conceivable angle. I had the forensic binder locked in my office. I possessed the paper trail required to dismantle their syndicate. But a binder cannot protect a human being from physical coercion. Helen was still residing in the Sarasota house. She was living under the daily surveillance of her captors, bound by the fraudulent power of attorney. If I dropped the hammer now, if I presented the evidence to the authorities, Trent and Diane would panic. Cornered animals lash out at the closest target. They would retaliate against Helen. They would execute their threat, declaring her incompetent and locking her away in a state facility to punish me for my interference. I needed to secure the matriarch. I needed an alliance with the one person who held the true title to the legacy. I had to speak to my grandmother away from the watchful eyes of the people draining her life. I started the engine. I pulled out of the country club gates. I would not wait for the next Sunday lunch. I would breach their perimeter long before they woke up to defend it. The Florida coastline possesses a specific quality of silence at 5 a.m. The oppressive heat of the previous day dissipates, leaving behind a thick layer of cool moisture that clings to the skin. The affluent neighborhoods of Sarasota remain dormant during this hour. The landscapers have not yet arrived to trim the pristine hedges, and the delivery trucks are still idling on the mainland. It is a narrow window of unmonitored time. I parked my practical sedan 3 blocks away from my grandmother's beachfront property. I did not want the sweep of my headlights to illuminate the front windows and alert the occupants of the house. Diane and Vanessa valued their curated beauty rest. They considered waking up before 8 o'clock a profound indignity. They treated their hostile occupation of the estate like a luxury vacation, assuming their fraudulent power of attorney functioned as an impenetrable security system. They believed they controlled the perimeter. But a perimeter is only effective if the guards are awake to watch the gate. I walked down the quiet street, my shoes making no sound against the damp pavement. I carried a thin leather portfolio tucked under my arm. It contained a curated selection of the evidence I had extracted from the county property database and the hospital billing archives. I reached the edge of the Mason estate. I bypassed the grand front entrance. I knew the cadence of this property intimately. I navigated the narrow stone path, winding around the side of the garage, pushing past the dew-soaked hibiscus bushes, and approached the rear lanai facing the Gulf of Mexico. The horizon was just beginning to turn a bruised shade of violet. The rhythmic sound of the waves breaking against the shoreline provided a steady, ambient cover. I stepped onto the wooden deck. I expected to find the patio empty. I planned to sit in the quiet and wait for the sun to rise before slipping inside to wake my grandmother. I was wrong. The matriarch was already awake. Helen Mason sat in a high-backed wicker chair facing the ocean. She was wrapped in a thick woven shawl. A ceramic mug rested on the glass table beside her, a thin ribbon of steam rising from the dark liquid. She did not look like a fragile woman suffering from cognitive decline. She did not display the confused, vacant stare Vanessa delighted in mocking during our Sunday lunches. Helen sat with her spine perfectly straight. Her posture radiated the fierce, uncompromising authority of a woman who had spent 5 decades commanding a room. She turned her head as my footsteps registered on the wooden deck. She did not startle. Her eyes locked onto mine, sharp and clear in the pre-dawn light. "You parked down the street," Helen said. Her voice was steady, stripped of the manufactured tremor she utilized when Diane was in the room. I nodded, stepping fully onto the lanai. "I wanted to ensure we had an uninterrupted window to review the ledger," I replied. Helen gestured to the empty chair across from her. I sat down. The ocean breeze moved the loose fabric of her shawl. I placed the leather portfolio on the glass patio table between us. I did not offer a gentle preamble. I do not soften bad news when the patient is already bleeding. I opened the folder. I extracted the forged quitclaim deed first. I laid the document flat against the glass. I pointed to the final page, guiding her attention to the notary stamp and the flawless replication of my cursive signature. I placed the corporate registry filing for Clearwater Coastal Holdings right next to it, highlighting my name listed as the managing member. Finally, I presented the routing data for the $50,000 wire transfer. I explained the nature of Apex Capital Solutions. I described the commercial mail drop in Hialeah and the predatory lending history of the managing partner. I mapped the entire architecture of the theft for her. I detailed how Trent was drowning in toxic debt and utilizing her life savings to satisfy dangerous creditors. I outlined how Diane had supplied my childhood Social Security card from her garage safe to facilitate the identity theft. I laid the betrayal bare under the violet morning sky. I watched my grandmother process the physical proof of her daughter's treason. Helen did not gasp. She did not press a hand to her chest or shed a single tear. She reached out and traced her index finger over the forged signature on the deed. Her expression hardened into a cold, clinical mask. The maternal warmth vanished, replaced by the calculating intellect of a survivor. Diane always possessed a profound talent for finding the shortest route to $1. Helen murmured, her tone devoid of affection. She prioritized her tennis club status over her own child. And Trent is simply a hollow suit pretending to be a titan. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. The realization washed over me with stunning clarity. I had arrived prepared to reveal a horrifying secret, only to discover I was reporting to a commanding officer who already understood the battlefield. "You knew," I stated. It was not a question. Helen picked up her coffee mug. She took a slow sip. "I knew they were bleeding the accounts, Mia. I recognized the missing jewelry. I saw the brokerage statements they attempted to intercept from the mailbox. I knew Trent was sinking. A man who brags about his wealth at every Sunday dinner is usually trying to convince himself the money still exists." I asked her why she surrendered. I asked her why she signed the power of attorney in the recovery room and allowed Vanessa to humiliate her with the patronizing baby talk. Helen set the mug down. The ceramic clicked sharply against the glass. "It was not a surrender," she replied. "It was a tactical retreat." She explained the harsh reality of her confinement. When Diane and Trent cornered her after the shoulder procedure, they held all the leverage. They weaponized her age. If Helen refused to sign the power of attorney, Trent promised to execute a petition for legal guardianship. He threatened to march into a courtroom, utilize the fabricated narrative of her mental decline, and strip her of her autonomy. "If I fought them directly in that hospital room," Helen explained, "they would have locked me inside a state-managed facility by the end of the week. I would have spent my final years staring at a linoleum floor, drugged into compliance. I needed to remain in my own home. I needed to maintain access to my own environment. So I gave them the performance they demanded." Helen had manufactured the trembling hands. She had orchestrated the confused stares and the forgotten conversations. She played the fading, helpless matriarch to keep her captors comfortable. Arrogant people become lazy when they believe their victims are powerless. By pretending her mind was slipping, Helen prevented Trent from executing the nuclear option. She traded a portion of her liquid assets to buy herself the time required to formulate an escape. But I lacked the tools to see the destination of the money Helen confessed, tapping the quitclaim deed. I knew they were stealing, but I could not access the digital routing logs. I could not see the shell companies. I needed an auditor. I needed you. We sat in the quiet dawn, two women who had independently chosen the exact same strategy. We had both utilized lethal calm. We had both absorbed the cruelty and the insults, allowing the thieves to build their paper-thin illusions while we mapped the perimeter of their crimes. Helen leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. She looked out at the Gulf of Mexico. Her husband, my grandfather William, had purchased this parcel of land when it was nothing but sand and scrub brush. He worked double shifts at a regional lumber yard, funneling every spare cent into the coastal dirt. He built the foundation of this estate with blistered hands and relentless discipline. I will not allow William's legacy to be liquidated to save a fraud. Helen stated, her voice possessing the density of iron. I will not let Diane fund her vanity with the equity your grandfather bled to secure." I nodded in agreement. We forged a silent pact in the humid Florida air. We did not require soaring speeches or emotional declarations. We shared a common enemy and a unified objective. We had to permanently sever their access to the estate. But as I looked at the power of attorney sitting in my portfolio, the true legal hurdle became apparent. The document Diane and Trent held was legally binding. It granted them total authority over Helen's personal assets. As long as the beachfront property and the investment portfolios remained in Helen's name, Trent could leverage them. I outlined the legal vulnerability to my grandmother. I explained that simply drafting a new last will and testament would not solve the crisis. If Helen passed away, Trent would immediately contest the new will in probate court. He would utilize the power of attorney and the established social smear campaign to argue that I had coerced her into changing the terms. He would drag the estate through years of litigation, draining the assets to pay his defense attorneys. "A standard will is merely a set of instructions," I told her. "Instructions can be challenged. Instructions can be ignored by a corrupt executor. We cannot leave the assets exposed on the board." Helen agreed, her mind tracking the logic flawlessly. "We must remove the pieces from the table entirely." If the property no longer belonged to Helen personally, the power of attorney would command an empty room. Trent could not leverage an asset his mother-in-law did not own. We needed a vault. We needed an impenetrable legal structure that bypassed the probate courts and stripped the power of attorney of its jurisdiction. We needed a mechanism stronger than a will. We needed an architect who specialized in building fortresses for high-net-worth clients. I knew exactly who to call. The sun crested the horizon, casting a brilliant gold light across the water. The time for observation had ended. The time for structural retaliation had arrived. Finding an attorney who matches the severity of a hostile takeover requires looking past the glossy advertisements. Men who untangle the financial wreckage of the coastal elite do not rent billboard space on the interstate. They operate in the quiet, insulated spaces where generational wealth attempts to hide its sins. I knew Marcus Sterling by reputation from my years in corporate compliance. He was a litigator who treated estate law like a tactical blood sport. He did not negotiate settlements or mediate familial grievances. He engineered unconditional surrenders. Bringing Marcus to the Sarasota property required calculated deception. Diane and Vanessa treated my grandmother's home like a monitored compound. They tracked the comings and goings of the housekeeping staff. They cross-referenced schedules and monitored the driveway. A man arriving in a bespoke tailored suit carrying a litigation briefcase would trigger immediate alarms, prompting Trent to accelerate his timeline. Marcus understood the assignment. He understood that our initial meeting required a camouflage of mundane utility. He arrived on a Thursday morning 2 days after my dawn meeting on the Lanai. He did not drive his personal luxury sedan. He parked a generic white fleet truck in the circular driveway. He stepped out wearing a faded polo shirt, heavy khaki work pants, and a high-visibility yellow vest. He carried a digital measuring laser and a worn aluminum clipboard. To any passing neighbor or watchful relative, he was simply a municipal insurance adjuster, evaluating the roof structure for coastal wind mitigation. He even paused on the front walkway, aiming his laser at the eaves of the porch, selling the performance flawlessly, just in case Diane had installed hidden surveillance cameras near the entrance. Helen opened the heavy wooden door and invited him inside. The moment the brass deadbolt clicked shut, the performance ended. Marcus stood in the foyer and set his aluminum clipboard on a side table. He unzipped a concealed compartment within his canvas messenger bag and extracted a pristine, slim leather portfolio. He did not offer warm pleasantries or sympathetic smiles. He moved with the surgical efficiency of a man assessing a crime scene. We gathered around the formal dining room table, the exact same piece of furniture where Vanessa routinely patronized our grandmother during Sunday lunches. Marcus opened his portfolio and extracted a copy of the durable power of attorney Trent had coerced Helen into signing in the recovery room. Marcus did not scoff at the document or express moral outrage over the extortion. Lawyers of his caliber do not waste vital energy on indignation. They look for structural vulnerabilities. He ran a gold fountain pen down the margins of the paper, tracing the specific clauses Diane and Trent believed provided them with impenetrable armor. He studied the paragraphs granting Trent total authority over the banking routes, the real estate transactions, and the investment liquidations. He looked up, setting his pen down on the polished oak surface. He explained the fundamental architecture of an agency agreement. A power of attorney grants Trent the legal authority to manipulate assets held in Helen Mason's personal name. Marcus stated, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded the room. Trent can access her checking accounts, leverage her real estate, and liquidate her mutual funds because the state recognizes him as her designated proxy. He is the authorized manager of the vault. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. However, a manager cannot govern an empty room, Marcus continued. If the assets no longer belong to Helen Mason personally, the power of attorney possesses zero jurisdiction. Trent's legal shield only functions if there is actual equity sitting behind it to protect. He proposed the construction of an irrevocable blind trust. He detailed the uncompromising finality of the legal mechanism. Unlike a standard revocable living trust, which can be altered, amended, or dissolved at the whim of the creator, an irrevocable trust functions as a one-way door. Once a physical asset or a financial portfolio passes the threshold, the original owner relinquishes all legal claim and ownership rights to it. The trust becomes an independent, self-sustaining legal entity. It bypasses the probate courts entirely. It neutralizes any future will Trent might attempt to forge or coerce. And most importantly, it renders the power of attorney effectively sterile. Helen looked at Marcus, her posture rigid and her eyes sharp. She asked, who would govern this independent entity? Marcus turned his gaze toward me. He stated that the trust required a fiduciary. I would be designated as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. I would possess total executive control over the assets, charged with managing them for the duration of my grandmother's life and inheriting them upon her passing. We spent the next 90 minutes executing the transfer. The volume of paperwork was substantial, requiring precise signatures and secondary initials on dozens of pages. Helen took the gold pen Marcus offered her. She did not hesitate. She signed the property deeds, officially moving the sprawling Sarasota beachfront estate out of her own name and into the legal shelter of the trust. She signed the transfer authorizations for the remaining brokerage portfolios. She signed the specific riders governing the vintage heirlooms, the diamond jewelry, and the antique silver my grandfather had purchased decades ago. While she signed the final pages, the low rumble of a vehicle engine echoed from the street outside. My pulse spiked. I walked to the front window, parting the wooden blinds just a fraction of an inch to peer out. A delivery van was executing a cumbersome turnaround in the cul-de-sac. The false alarm served as a stark, adrenaline-fueled reminder of our fragile timeline. Vanessa was scheduled to arrive for her afternoon caregiver shift in less than 40 minutes. We were operating inside a closing window. Helen set the pen down on the table. She rubbed her right wrist, the physical toll of signing her entire life away, registering in the slight stiffness of her joints. Yet her expression radiated a profound, chilling satisfaction. On paper, my grandmother was now a destitute woman. Her personal estate was a hollow shell. It contained nothing but the clothes hanging in her closet and a minimal checking account balance designed specifically to maintain the illusion of normalcy for Trent's monitoring eyes. She had willingly traded the illusion of ownership for the absolute guarantee of protection. Marcus gathered the stack of executed documents. He tapped the edges against the table to align them, returning the thick file to his leather portfolio and sliding the portfolio back into his canvas messenger bag. He slipped the high-visibility yellow vest back over his tailored shirt and picked up his aluminum clipboard. He informed us that the paperwork would be filed under seal with the state registry by the end of the business day. The original wet ink copies would be transported directly to his firm and locked inside a subterranean vault. The documents would reside far beyond the reach of any local probate judge any corrupted family lawyer or any desperate son-in-law. Marcus walked out the front door, seamlessly resuming his role as the tedious, overworked municipal inspector. I watched his generic white fleet truck pull out of the driveway, merge onto the coastal road, and disappear from sight. The trap was officially set. The heavy steel jaws of the mechanism were pulled wide open, buried just beneath the surface of their curated reality. Diane and Trent were entirely oblivious. They still believed they held the keys to a prosperous kingdom. They did not know the locks had been changed and the treasury had been emptied out the back door. We simply had to wait for Trent to step on the trigger. We did not have to wait long. Arrogance breeds a specific type of laziness, but impending financial ruin breeds reckless velocity. Ignorant of the fact that his power of attorney was now a worthless piece of paper, Trent was running out of time. His creditors in Orlando were done issuing warnings. They were filing formal mechanics liens against his stalled condominium project. The slow, methodical siphoning of Helen's residual cash could no longer satisfy the predatory lenders pacing outside his corporate office. He needed a massive, immediate injection of untethered capital to keep his sinking ship afloat for another month. He needed to extract raw equity directly from the Sarasota beachfront house. He was about to initiate a bank transfer that would test the structural integrity of our new fortress, and the resulting collision would drag our silent war out of the shadows and into the harsh light of day. A desperate man operates on a shrinking timeline. In the commercial development sector, financial ruin does not happen overnight. It is a slow suffocation caused by 1,000 unpaid invoices. Trent was in the final stages of oxygen deprivation. The subcontractors in Orlando had ceased sending polite reminders. They were filing formal mechanics liens against his stalled condominium project. These legal encumbrances acted like concrete weights, dragging his entire portfolio under the surface. More terrifying than the legitimate contractors were the quiet men in Miami. Apex Capital Solutions did not utilize collection agencies. High-interest private lenders operate outside the bounds of traditional banking regulations. They rely on the implicit promise of physical consequence to ensure repayment. Trent needed liquid cash to appease them, and he needed it before the end of the week. Ignorant of the empty vault sitting in Sarasota, Trent turned his attention back to the beachfront property. He believed the durable power of attorney remained his golden ticket. He just needed a plausible justification to extract raw equity from the estate without raising alarms within the family or the local municipality. He engineered a fabricated medical crisis. He informed Diane and Vanessa that Helen's declining mobility required immediate structural modifications to the house. He proposed the installation of a custom wheelchair ramp and a fully accessible walk-in shower. It was a vile piece of theater, utilizing his victim's supposed physical frailty to justify the theft. Armed with this philanthropic alibi, Trent submitted a formal draw request against the existing home equity line of credit attached to the Sarasota property. The requested amount was $50,000. He assumed the bank would process the paperwork, honor his proxy signature, and wire the funds into a joint account he controlled within 3 business days. He expected a seamless transaction. He did not anticipate the structural integrity of the fortress we had built in the dark. The financial institution initiated their standard verification protocols. When a bank authorizes a substantial draw against a property, they pull the current title to ensure the collateral remains unencumbered. The title search returned a hard stop. The system flagged the request, halting the transfer of funds. The deed to the coastal estate no longer belonged to Helen Mason. The legal owner of record was now the Helen Mason Trust. The bank dispatched a formal rejection notice to Trent, informing him that a personal power of attorney lacked the jurisdictional authority to leverage assets held within an independent trust entity. Trent received the rejection letter on a Thursday afternoon. I can only imagine the sheer terror that gripped him when he read the banking decree. His immediate lifeline had been severed. But arrogance provides a dangerous insulation against reality. Trent was a real estate developer, but he was lazy with legal nuance. He possessed a superficial understanding of estate law. When he saw the word trust, he did not fathom the existence of Marcus Sterling's irrevocable masterpiece. Middle-class families frequently establish standard, revocable living trusts to bypass the tedious probate process. These common instruments are flexible and easily amended. Trent looked at the rejection letter and made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed Helen had authorized a generic revocable trust years ago, long before her memory supposedly began to slip, and simply forgot to mention it. He believed the trust was a minor bureaucratic hurdle, a flimsy paper shield that a freshly drafted definitive last will and testament could easily pierce. He concluded that if he produced a new will explicitly revoking all prior estate planning documents, he could override the trust upon her passing. However, a new will would not solve his immediate need for the $50,000. The Miami creditors were still waiting. Trent needed a scapegoat for the banking delay. His fragile ego demanded an external target for his frustration. He deduced that the sudden administrative blockade was not a coincidence. He assumed I had utilized my professional compliance network to flag the transaction and stall his funding. He decided he needed to intimidate the auditor. He needed to ensure my future silence. My office is located on the 3rd floor of the Regional Medical Center, situated at the end of a long, sterile corridor lined with administrative suites. The environment smells perpetually of industrial bleach and sharp antiseptic. The rhythmic, distant beeping of telemetry monitors serves as a constant reminder of the fragile nature of human life. It is a place of clinical order. It is not a venue for domestic hostility. I was walking toward the staff elevators, holding a stack of audited vendor files, when a large figure stepped out from the alcove near the stairwell. Trent blocked my path. The pristine illusion of the booming developer had fractured. His custom Italian suit looked rumpled, the fabric pulling awkwardly across his shoulders. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his forehead, despite the chilled air conditioning of the hospital wing. His pupils were dilated, betraying the primal, vibrating panic thrumming beneath his skin. He closed the distance between us, invading my personal space. The scent of stale coffee and sour adrenaline radiated from his collar. He did not shout. He knew better than to create a public disturbance in a healthcare facility filled with security personnel. Instead, he lowered his voice to a venomous, trembling hiss. He raised his right hand and shoved his index finger inches from my face. "I know what you are doing, Mia," Trent whispered, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. "You think you can use your little hospital connections to freeze those accounts? You think you can stall the renovations your own grandmother desperately needs? You are playing a very dangerous game." I stopped walking. I held the vendor files against my chest. I did not flinch away from his pointing finger. I analyzed his posture through the lens of a trained investigator. He was leading with his chin projecting his chest forward in a classic display of feigned dominance. It is the universal body language of a predator realizing it has wandered into a trap and trying to frighten the cage away. "If you interfere with the estate again," Trent continued, the threat dripping from every syllable, "I will call the hospital board. I will tell them you are utilizing confidential patient databases to harass your own family. I will fabricate an ethical violation so severe they will strip your credentials before lunch. I will dismantle your entire auditing career. Do you understand me?" The threat was a hollow, desperate grasp for leverage. A man holding a winning hand does not need to corner you in a hallway to explain his power. He simply plays his cards. Trent was out of chips, and he was trying to win the pot through sheer intimidation. He expected me to cower. He anticipated a frantic denial, a promise to back down, or a tearful plea for my job. I offered him the weaponization of the void. I stood perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights. I maintained unbroken eye contact, my face a serene, unreadable mask. I let his threat echo into the sterile silence of the corridor. I did not offer a single word of defense. I refused to grant his panic the validation of a response. My silence infuriated him. The lack of friction denied him the release he craved. His chest heaved. He lowered his pointing finger, his hand curling into a tight, frustrated fist at his side. He interpreted my stillness as a paralyzing fear. He believed his intimidation tactic had succeeded in neutralizing the threat I posed. "You stay out of the paperwork," Trent growled, stepping back toward the stairwell. "I will fix the estate planning myself. I am getting a lawyer who understands how to handle stubborn old women and broken trusts. You just watch your back." He turned and pushed through the heavy fire doors, his footsteps echoing rapidly down the concrete stairwell. I remained in the hallway, the antiseptic air settling back into its quiet rhythm. I did not feel fear. I felt the cold, undeniable satisfaction of a confirmed hypothesis. Trent was going to procure a shady attorney. He was going to attempt to override a document he fundamentally misunderstood. And the timeline was about to accelerate because Helen's actual health was preparing to fail, offering them the final tragic window they needed to execute their trap. The relentless, suffocating humidity of the Florida summer finally broke in late October, replaced by a steady, gray drizzle that washed the color out of the coastal landscape. The shift in the weather mirrored the sharp decline in my grandmother's physical condition. The fabricated medical crises Trent and Diane had orchestrated for months were suddenly replaced by genuine, unavoidable biological failure. Helen's heart, having spent 8 decades pumping blood through a fierce and uncompromising frame, began to falter. The fluid accumulated. Her breathing became labored. The physicians at the Regional Medical Center recommended an immediate transfer to a private hospice facility located just off the interstate. The hospice room smelled of sterilized linen and muted antiseptic. It was a space designed for quiet transitions, featuring a large window that overlooked a small manicured garden slick with autumn rain. I spent my evenings sitting in the stiff vinyl chair beside her bed. We did not discuss the shadow trust locked in Marcus Sterling's vault. We did not discuss the $12 million embezzlement or the fraudulent LLC registered in my name. We discussed the rain. We discussed the tides. We preserved the dignity of her final days by keeping the corporate war outside the door. But a war does not respect a sanctuary. The breach occurred on a Tuesday afternoon. The heavy oak door of the hospice room swung open without a preliminary knock. Diane entered first, wrapped in a designer trench coat that cost more than the monthly salary of the nursing staff down the hall. Vanessa followed closely behind, clutching a leather handbag like a shield. Trent flanked them, accompanied by a man holding a sleek, dark briefcase. I recognized the man immediately, not by name, but by taxonomy. In the compliance sector, you learn to identify the attorneys who prioritize billable hours over ethical constraints. They possess a practiced, sympathetic tilt to their heads and wear suits that pull a fraction too tight across the shoulders. They are the legal mechanics hired to install the locks on stolen doors. Trent directed the attending nurses to step outside, citing confidential family matters. The medical staff hesitated, glancing toward me where I stood near the window. I offered a single, microscopic nod. The nurses filed out, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly against the linoleum, and the heavy door clicked shut behind them. I remained stationed by the glass. The gray rain blurred the garden outside. The syndicate did not ask me to leave the room. They wanted an audience for my humiliation. They required my physical presence to validate their triumph and witness my own erasure. Diane approached the bed. She leaned over Helen, deploying a sickly sweet register that coated the sterile room in artificial warmth. She smoothed a stray lock of gray hair away from her mother's forehead, playing the role of the devoted caregiver with terrifying ease. "We brought some standard paperwork," Mom Diane murmured, her voice steady and practiced. "Just some administrative housekeeping to ensure everything is protected. We want to bypass the tedious probate courts so you do not have to worry about a thing." The attorney stepped forward, setting his briefcase on the rolling tray table. He popped the brass latches and produced a thick stack of stapled parchment, the last will and testament. He unscrewed the cap of an expensive fountain pen and began reading the pertinent clauses aloud. His tone was brisk and clinical, stripping the emotion from the theft. The text was a masterpiece of orchestrated greed. It explicitly revoked all prior estate planning documents, rendering any previous iterations void. It designated Vanessa as the sole heir to the Sarasota beachfront property, the investment portfolios, and the vintage heirlooms. Then came the specific paragraph engineered to sever my claim. The attorney cleared his throat and read the disinheritance clause. The legal text stated, I was being excluded from the estate due to a lack of familial support, persistent emotional detachment, and a failure to participate in caregiving duties during Helen's final years. I stood by the window and listened to the perjury. They had codified their social smear campaign into a legal decree. They had taken every whisper from the country club, every fake sympathetic text message, and every manufactured slight, transforming those lies into binding ink. They were etching my villainy into the public record. Trent stood at the foot of the bed. His weight shifted nervously from one foot to the other. His eyes were locked on the paper, hungry and desperate. He was minutes away from securing the collateral he needed to appease the predatory lenders waiting in Miami. His pristine exterior was cracking, revealing the terrified debtor underneath. Vanessa offered a heavy, theatrical sigh. She looked toward me, her gaze dripping with toxic pity. She wanted me to fracture. She wanted me to lunge across the room, snatch the document from the attorney, and scream about the injustice. I did not break my posture. I kept my hands folded over the fabric of my skirt. I watched the vultures circle the matriarch. I offered them the profound, unnerving stillness of a confirmed audit. The attorney held the silver pen out toward Helen. Helen looked at the sleek metal instrument. She looked at the daughter who had sold her identity to fund a tennis club membership. She looked at the granddaughter who had mocked her intellect. She looked at the son-in-law who had threatened her freedom. Then she shifted her eyes toward the window. She met my gaze. A silent electric current passed between us. I saw the memory flash in her sharp, unclouded eyes. The memory of a kitchen table in Sarasota, a lined sheet of paper, and a lesson about the weight of a signature. She had taught me never to let anyone hold my pen. She had taught me that a signature is a lock. But Helen and I both knew a fundamental truth about locks. A lock is only valuable if it secures a full vault. The document resting on her lap governed an estate that possessed a net worth of exactly $0. The beachfront property, the brokerage accounts, and the diamonds were already shielded inside the impenetrable architecture of Marcus Sterling's irrevocable blind trust. Helen was not signing away her legacy. She was signing a piece of worthless paper that granted Trent dominion over an empty room. Helen offered a weak, trembling smile. It was a flawless performance, capturing the fragile resignation of a dying woman yielding to the inevitable pressure of her family. She reached out with a shaky hand. Her frail fingers closed around the barrel of the pen. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of the rain against the window pane and the deliberate scratch of the metal nib across the heavy parchment. Helen formed the cursive loops and sharp angles of her name, the same precise letters she had taught me to write decades ago. She finished the signature and let her hand fall back against the sterile white blanket. Trent exhaled a sharp, jagged breath. It was the sound of a drowning man breaking the surface of the water. The attorney retrieved the document quickly, applying his own signature and the required witness seals. He handed the finalized paperwork to Trent. Trent folded the document with eager, twitching fingers. He slid the parchment into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He patted the fabric, securing the prize against his chest. He believed he had won. He assumed he had just rescued his collapsing real estate portfolio, secured his opulent lifestyle, and permanently erased the quiet auditor standing by the window. He did not realize he had just pocketed his own confession. By forcing a dying woman to sign a newly drafted will under obvious orchestrated duress, Trent provided the exact evidence of coercion our litigator needed to execute the forensic checkmate. He had handed us the smoking gun required to trigger the federal statutes. The trap we built in the dark was now fully armed, the spring pulled tight, and ready to snap. Diane kissed her mother's forehead, promising to visit the following afternoon with a forced, airy cheerfulness. Vanessa offered a final victorious glance in my direction, her chin tilted upward in triumph. Trent checked his luxury watch, his mind already calculating the liquidation timeline for the coastal property. The syndicate filed out of the hospice room, leaving Helen and me alone in the quiet hum of the medical machinery. I walked over to the bed and sat down in the vinyl chair. Helen looked at me. The fragile, compliant facade melted away, revealing the fierce, calculating survivor beneath the surface. We did not celebrate the successful deception. We recognized the grim reality of the moment. The performance was over, and the final transition was approaching. The paper trail was secure, but the cost of the victory was the imminent loss of the woman who had orchestrated it. 2 weeks later, the telemetry monitors in the hospice room fell silent. The matriarch of the Mason family passed away, and the battleground immediately shifted from the quiet bedside to the crowded, highly visible pews of a funeral chapel. The victory lap was about to begin. Grief is a private architecture. It requires a quiet, isolated foundation to process the finality of an empty room. I mourned my grandmother in the early hours of a Thursday morning, sitting alone in my apartment while the Florida rain washed the dark streets outside my window. I permitted myself to feel the profound, hollow ache of her absence, without an audience. I remembered her sharp intellect, her unyielding posture, and the steady cadence of her voice. By the time the sun broke through the coastal clouds, I locked the sorrow away inside a mental vault. The impending battlefield did not allow for emotional indulgence. By the time the obituary reached the local newspaper, Diane and Vanessa had already transformed the tragedy into a social gala. They treated the funeral not as a memorial service for a beloved matriarch, but as a debutante ball for their newly acquired wealth. They engaged an elite event planner. They selected a sprawling, affluent chapel in downtown Tampa, ensuring the venue matched the exclusive tax bracket they believed they had just entered. When Diane walked through the heavy oak doors of the chapel, the visual symbolism was staggering. She did not wear the subdued, respectful attire of a grieving daughter. She wore a custom-tailored mourning suit. The fabric was a heavy imported Italian wool, cut with a razor-sharp precision that spoke of private boutique fittings. The silk lining rustled faintly as she walked down the central aisle. It was an extravagant garment, a piece of wearable theater. I looked at the immaculate stitching and recognized the transaction. She had purchased the suit using the unauthorized capital siphoned from Helen's accounts via the fraudulent power of attorney. Diane had literally clothed herself in the wealth she drained from her own mother. She wore the theft on her shoulders, parading the embezzled equity in front of the congregation. Trent hovered near the vestibule, acting as the gregarious host. The terrified, sweating debtor who had cornered me in the hospital corridor was gone. The pristine illusion of the booming commercial developer had returned in full force. He shook hands with the arriving guests, his voice projecting a loud, unearned confidence. I watched him greet a pair of men wearing sharp suits and predatory expressions. The creditors. Trent clapped one of the men on the shoulder, leaning in to whisper a conspiratorial promise. He was dropping heavy hints about an impending beachfront real estate liquidation. He was spending the phantom fortune in his mind, buying himself a few more weeks of breathing room with the guarantee of a coastal windfall. The service itself was a masterclass in perjury. Diane stood at the pulpit, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed lace handkerchief. She delivered a eulogy focused entirely on her own fabricated sacrifices. She painted a vivid picture of a devoted family unit holding the matriarch's hand through the fading twilight. She did not mention the extortion in the recovery room. She omitted the forged quitclaim deed. Vanessa sat in the front pew nodding in solemn agreement, playing the role of the exhausted, loyal caregiver. I sat in the fourth row surrounded by extended relatives who offered me sideways, pitying glances. I maintained a rigid, uncompromising posture. I did not shed a single tear. Weeping in their presence would feel like a concession. It would grant them the satisfaction of witnessing my pain. I kept my face impassive, offering them nothing but the cold, clinical stillness of an auditor observing a corrupted ledger. Following the burial, the syndicate hosted a lavish reception at Vanessa's country club. The venue smelled of roasted tenderloin and expensive floral arrangements. The catering staff moved silently through the room, balancing silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. It was a victory lap, funded entirely by stolen capital. The atmosphere buzzed with the low electric hum of affluent networking. I retreated to the periphery of the dining hall. I stood near a quiet alcove holding a simple glass of iced water. I possessed no desire to mingle with the architects of my intended ruin. From my vantage point, I possessed a clear line of sight to the center of the room. Vanessa was holding court. She was surrounded by the exact same circle of influential wives who had attended her previous brunch, the women who were primed to serve as character witnesses for my federal indictment. Vanessa adopted the weary, burdened mantle of the new estate owner. She swirled a glass of Chardonnay, her posture radiating a smug, proprietary exhaustion. I listened to her voice carry over the ambient chatter. She was complaining. She lamented the impending logistical nightmare of managing the Sarasota property. She bemoaned the exorbitant coastal property taxes, sighing heavily as she calculated the annual liability for her audience. She complained about the skyrocketing cost of hurricane insurance and the tedious, ongoing effort required to secure reliable landscaping contractors for such an extensive parcel of land. "It is just such a heavy burden to carry," Vanessa told her eager listeners, her tone dripping with false martyrdom. "But Trent and I are prepared to shoulder the responsibility to preserve the family legacy. We owe it to Grandma to maintain the standard she set." The dramatic irony was a tangible, physical sensation in the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. The cold liquid matched the temperature in my chest. I savored the bitter sweetness of her unearned complaining. Vanessa was agonizing over the tax liability of an estate she would never possess. She was stressing over the maintenance of a lawn she had zero legal right to walk across. She was complaining about the insurance premiums on a house that belonged entirely to an irrevocable blind trust. She was the temporary, arrogant queen of an empty castle, bragging to her court about the weight of a crown she did not own. As the reception began to wind down, the crowd thinned. Vanessa spotted me standing alone in the shadows of the alcove. Her victory lap felt incomplete without a final, direct assertion of dominance. She separated from her affluent circle and walked toward me. As she approached, I noticed the jewelry sparkling on her earlobes. They were large, brilliant-cut stones catching the ambient light. But the refraction was wrong. The clarity was artificial. They were cubic zirconia. The vintage, authentic diamonds she usually wore had vanished, undoubtedly pawned by her husband weeks ago to appease the private lenders in Miami. She was wearing glass to project wealth, a perfect visual metaphor for her entire existence. Vanessa stopped 2 feet away from me. She placed a condescending hand on my shoulder, a gesture designed to mimic comfort while delivering poison. "I know today is difficult for you, Mia," Vanessa whispered. Her tone was laced with a venomous pity. "We all process grief differently, but you need to be realistic about the future. Do not expect any handouts from the estate. Grandma made her final wishes very clear at the end. It is time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet." I looked at the fake diamonds. I looked at the sister who had happily curated a social motive for my felony frame job. I did not flinch away from her touch. I offered a serene, impenetrable nod. "I understand perfectly, Vanessa," I replied, my voice projecting a smooth, effortless calm. "I have no expectations of a handout. I look forward to the official reading of the will." I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving her standing in the alcove. The date for the legal proceeding was already set for the following Tuesday in downtown Tampa. The syndicate believed they were walking into a coronation. They had isolated the matriarch, drained the accounts, framed the innocent party, and secured the final legal decree. They did not know they were walking into a forensic execution. The timeline converges on a Tuesday morning in downtown Tampa. The 14 months of silent endurance, the late nights parsing encrypted routing numbers, and the careful curation of evidence coalesce into a single room. We sat around the expansive mahogany table inside the law office Diane and Trent had selected for their victory lap. The environment was engineered for intimidation. The air conditioning hummed at a low freezing register, a stark contrast to the oppressive Florida heat radiating against the thick, tinted glass of the exterior windows. My mother wore her bespoke morning suit, her posture rigid and expectant. Vanessa sat beside her, radiating the unearned arrogance of a woman who believed she had just inherited a coastal dynasty. Trent occupied the chair to Vanessa's right. He had shed the terrified demeanor of a drowning debtor and reinstated his boisterous developer persona. He wore a crisp navy suit and a platinum watch, projecting the illusion of immense liquid wealth while secretly dodging calls from predatory lenders in Miami. At the head of the table sat the attorney they had hired to facilitate the theft. He was a man who traded his ethical obligations for premium billable hours. He possessed a smooth, practiced cadence, reading the coerced last will and testament with a clinical detachment that sanitized the underlying extortion. He navigated the dense legal paragraphs officially revoking all prior estate planning documents. He read the specific clauses transferring the Sarasota beachfront property, the diverse investment portfolios, and the vintage family heirlooms directly to Vanessa and her husband. He reached the final page and recited the disinheritance clause, cementing my exclusion from the legacy due to a fabricated lack of familial support. The attorney set the document down on the polished wood. He unscrewed the cap of his pen, aligned the pages neatly, and folded his hands. The reading was concluded. The trap was formally executed on the official record. Trent leaned back in his leather chair. The leather creaked under his shifting weight. He crossed his ankles beneath the table and offered me a smile devoid of any genuine warmth. It was the expression of a predator assessing a trapped asset. "Well, that seems airtight," Trent declared. His voice filled the quiet room, loud and dripping with patronizing authority. The house, the accounts, the cars, it all passes to Vanessa. "I think we are done here, Mia." He gestured toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. He was dismissing me from my own family history. He wanted to twist the knife, ensuring I understood the totality of my defeat. "The receptionist can validate your parking on the way out," Trent added. "We will have our legal team draft the severance check we discussed. It is time for you to move on." Diane adjusted her posture, tilting her chin upward. She waited for me to crumble. Vanessa watched my hands, eager to see my fingers tremble or clench into fists. They had spent over a year gaslighting a dying matriarch, stealing my identity, and constructing a flawless social smear campaign. They anticipated the sweet reward of my emotional collapse. They wanted tears. They expected a shouted defense regarding the stolen Social Security card or a frantic accusation of forgery. If I raised my voice, I would grant them the chaotic reaction they needed to validate their narrative. I would become the bitter, unstable sister they had described to the country club wives. I did not grip the edge of the table. I did not alter the rhythm of my breathing. In my profession, when a corrupt hospital administrator believes they have successfully hidden a fraudulent ledger, they often boast during the final audit interview. They offer unsolicited advice. They act expansive and generous. You do not interrupt their performance. You sit in absolute silence and let them document their own arrogance. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I looked directly at Trent, meeting his smug gaze with a serene, impenetrable stare. The silence stretched across the mahogany table. It grew dense and uncomfortable, replacing their triumphant energy with a creeping, formless anxiety. Trent uncrossed his ankles. The lack of friction denied him the release he craved. Before Trent could repeat his demand, a subtle shift occurred at the head of the table. The shady attorney they had hired stopped looking at his paperwork. His attention drifted toward the frosted glass panels flanking the conference room entrance. A shadow moved beyond the glass. The heavy oak doors did not open with a polite, hesitant push. They swung inward with smooth, undeniable force. Marcus Sterling stepped over the threshold. He did not pause to ask permission to enter a private legal proceeding. Men who dismantle empires do not wait for an invitation. Marcus carried a slim, elegant leather briefcase. He wore a dark, tailored suit that spoke of old money and ruthless litigation. His presence immediately stripped the oxygen from the room. Trent shot up from his chair. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. The sudden intrusion shattered his curated authority.
"Excuse me, who are you?" Trent demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "This is a private, legal proceeding. You need to wait in the lobby."
Marcus did not look at Trent. He did not acknowledge the booming real estate developer or the indignant matriarch sitting nearby. Marcus treated Trent like a misplaced piece of furniture. He walked with measured, deliberate steps down the length of the room, bypassing my isolated chair, and stopped near the head of the table. He directed his predatory gaze entirely toward the opposing counsel. "You have read the last will and testament of Helen Mason?" Marcus asked. His baritone voice was smooth and surgical, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a superior predator. Trent's attorney swallowed hard. He recognized Marcus. In the insular world of high-net-worth asset protection, Marcus Sterling was a known quantity. He was the apex threat. The shady lawyer offered a tight, nervous nod, his confidence evaporating under Marcus's scrutiny. "Good," Marcus said. Marcus set his elegant briefcase on the polished mahogany surface. He popped the brass latches with 2 crisp clicks. He reached inside his jacket and extracted a thick, pristine envelope bearing my name. The seal was unbroken. "As the legal representative for the Helen Mason Irrevocable Trust, I am here to inform you that the document you just read governs an estate valued at exactly $0, Marcus stated. The declaration landed like a physical blow. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Trent froze, his mouth parted in mid-sentence. Diane stopped breathing. Vanessa stared at the leather briefcase, her eyes wide with sudden, uncomprehending terror. Marcus slid a silver letter opener under the heavy wax seal of the envelope. The paper tore with a sharp, definitive sound. He extracted a thick stack of bonded parchment. These were not generic templated pages printed from a suburban law office. These were the foundational documents of an impenetrable financial fortress. Marcus placed his fingertips on the edge of the stack. He pushed the documents down the center of the table. The paper glided over the polished wood, stopping mere inches from the forged last will and testament. 4 months ago, Mrs. Mason transferred the deed to the Sarasota beachfront property, all investment portfolios, and all physical assets into a blind trust, Marcus explained. His tone was devoid of gloating. He delivered the facts with the lethal detachment of a medical examiner announcing a time of death. The trust is impenetrable, irreversible, and entirely immune to the probate process, Marcus continued. Mia Mason is the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Trent stared at the documents resting in front of him. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He looked at the word irrevocable stamped across the header. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed him. He had spent 14 months orchestrating a flawless theft. He had extorted a dying woman in a recovery room. He had forged a quitclaim deed. He had risked federal prison to secure the collateral necessary to appease the loan sharks in Miami. He believed he had reached the finish line. He was just beginning to realize the finish line was a painted wall. "The will you possess is legally binding," Marcus concluded, retrieving his briefcase and taking a single step back from the table. "But it commands an empty room." The silence that followed was absolute. The intricate web of lies, the whisper campaigns at the country club, the stolen Social Security card, and the coerced signature in the hospice facility were all rendered entirely meaningless in the span of 60 seconds. Trent held a piece of paper that granted him total dominion over a kingdom that no longer existed. The smugness melted off Vanessa's face, replaced by a hollow, sickening shock. She looked at her husband, searching for the booming authority he always projected. She found only a terrified, drowning man. Diane clutched her designer purse against her chest, her knuckles turning white. The country club facade was crumbling around her. Trent's hands began to tremble. The realization of his impending ruin short-circuited his nervous system. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table. The impact rattled the water glasses and echoed harshly against the wood paneling. "That is fraud," Trent yelled. His voice was shrill, cracking under the immense pressure of his outstanding debts. She was not of sound mind. "We have a durable power of attorney. I will contest this. I will tie this up in probate court for a decade. You will never see a dime of that property." His outburst was the chaotic, desperate reaction they had anticipated from me. He was unraveling, grasping at legal mechanisms he fundamentally misunderstood. A power of attorney cannot pierce an irrevocable trust. A probate court possesses zero jurisdiction over assets removed from a personal estate prior to death. Trent was threatening to fight a ghost. I watched him panic. I watched the syndicate realize their guaranteed bailout had vanished into thin air. Marcus had delivered the legal checkmate, neutralizing their access to the matriarch's legacy. But neutralizing the theft was only the first phase of the operation. The estate was secure. Now it was time to address the forgery, the identity theft, and the $84,000 Trent had already siphoned from Helen's accounts before the vault was locked. It was time to shift the battlefield from probate court to federal jurisdiction. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my heavy leather tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and placed my hand on the thick, color-coded forensic audit binder waiting inside. The time for silent observation was officially over. The heavy leather tote bag rested against the carpeted floor of the conference room. I gripped the thick spine of the color-coded forensic audit binder and lifted it into the chilled air. I placed it onto the polished mahogany surface. The dense accumulation of paper and plastic sleeves landed with a dull, resonant thud. The sound cut through the frantic echo of Trent's ongoing tirade about probate judges and legal rights. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. His jaw hung slack. He stared at the blue vinyl cover of the binder as if it were an unexploded ordnance placed directly on his dinner plate. I did not raise my voice to capture the room. When you possess the definitive ledger, you do not need to shout over the accused. You wait for their panic to exhaust itself. And then you present the math. "You will not file a single motion in probate court, Trent," I said. My voice was a flat, even baritone, devoid of any sympathetic tremor. "You will not contest the irrevocable trust, and you will not approach a judge. If you attempt to initiate any formal legal proceedings regarding Helen's estate, this binder becomes public record." I placed my fingertips against the edge of the blue cover and pushed. The heavy binder glided across the smooth wood. It traveled the length of the table and came to a halt mere inches from Trent's white-knuckled grip. He looked down at the plastic tabs protruding from the edges of the pages. Green, red, blue. The meticulous categorization of his own impending ruin. "Open it," I instructed. Trent did not move. His bravado had evaporated, leaving behind a fragile, trembling shell of a man. His bespoke navy suit suddenly looked ill-fitting, sagging over shoulders that were caving inward. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. When a fraudster refuses to examine their own ledger, the auditor must read it into the record for them. I kept my posture rigid and my eyes locked onto his pale face. The first section details the exact sum of $84,000 I stated, letting the numerical value hang in the sterile air of the law office. That is the precise amount of capital you successfully siphoned from Helen's mutual funds and secondary checking accounts before Marcus Sterling secured the remainder of her assets behind the trust. You utilized the coerced power of attorney to liquidate her conservative retirement portfolios under the guise of future care costs. Vanessa shifted in her chair. The smug proprietary arrogance she had worn since walking into the chapel had vanished entirely. Her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. She turned her head toward her husband. $84,000, Vanessa whispered. Her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. Trent, what is she talking about? You said the business just had a minor cash flow hiccup. Trent refused to look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the blue cover of the binder, as if breaking eye contact would trigger a detonation. He did not experience a minor hiccup, Vanessa. I continued answering the question he was too terrified to address. He experienced a catastrophic structural default. The $84,000 did not go toward contractor invoices in Orlando. It did not fund a new development project. I traced the routing numbers. The capital was wired directly to a commercial mail drop in Hialeah belonging to a limited liability company called Apex Capital Solutions. The name of the firm hung in the room. Trent squeezed his eyes shut. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. Apex Capital Solutions is a predatory lending syndicate, I explained, keeping my tone surgical and precise. Trent exhausted his traditional lines of credit months ago. He leveraged his properties into insolvency and turned to private, high-interest loan sharks to maintain the illusion of your affluent lifestyle. He is paying blood money to men who do not utilize collection agencies to settle their debts. Vanessa recoiled physically. She pressed her spine against the back of her leather chair. Her gaze darted from Trent's sweating face to the cubic zirconia earrings reflected in the polished wood of the table. The grim reality of her situation was snapping into focus. The opulent dinners, the leased luxury vehicles, the country club memberships were all financed by toxic debt and stolen inheritance. She was married to a bankrupt Mark. I did not offer my sister any comforting platitudes. I turned my attention back to the cornered developer. The theft of the $84,000 is a severe civil matter, I said. But the red tabs in that binder document your transition into federal territory. I watched Trent swallow hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his tight collar. He knew what was coming next. Turn to the red section, Trent, I commanded. Look at the quitclaim deed for the vacant commercial lot in Clearwater. He reached out with a shaky hand and flipped the heavy cover open. He bypassed the financial ledgers and stopped on the scanned property transfer document. He stared at the flawless forgery of my cursive signature, resting on the bottom line. You realized the slow drain of mutual funds could no longer satisfy the creditors in Miami, I stated. You needed a massive injection of untethered equity. You engineered a fraudulent holding company called Clearwater Coastal Holdings and attempted to transfer Helen's prime real estate into it. You intended to liquidate the parcel and funnel the proceeds into your failing enterprise. Trent opened his mouth to formulate a denial, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. And because you required a scapegoat to absorb the fallout when the theft was eventually discovered, you listed me as the managing member of the fraudulent LLC, I said. You forged my signature to frame me for felony elder abuse. You intended to feed me to the criminal justice system to purchase your own freedom. I paused, allowing the sheer malicious weight of the crime to settle over the audience. The shady attorney, sitting at the head of the table, pushed his chair back a few inches. He was visibly distancing himself from his clients. He recognized the irrefutable evidence of a federal wire fraud and identity theft ring. But you are a lazy thief, Trent, I continued. You assumed paperwork was merely a formality. You utilized the notary stamp of your former administrative assistant, Sarah Jenkins. You failed to realize her state commission expired 2 years prior. The metadata verifying the expiration is printed on the page directly behind the forged deed. Your sloppiness handed me the exact mechanism to invalidate the transfer. Trent slumped forward. He rested his elbows on the table and buried his face in his hands. The booming patriarch of the Orlando real estate market was reduced to a weeping, trembling liability. He was broken. But neutralizing the son-in-law was only half the objective. The true betrayal, the wound that required the most clinical cauterization, did not originate from the desperate developer. It originated from the woman sitting to his left. I shifted my gaze away from Trent. I locked my eyes onto Diane. My mother sat frozen in her bespoke Italian wool morning suit. The extravagant black fabric looked less like a symbol of high society grief and more like the uniform of a condemned prisoner. Her skin possessed the pallor of old parchment. She clutched her designer handbag against her stomach like a shield that could somehow deflect the incoming artillery. Forging a signature requires nothing but a pen and practice, I said, addressing Diane directly. But establishing a functional corporate entity with the state registry requires stringent identity verification. It requires historical tax returns and a verified Social Security number. Diane's jaw trembled. She pressed her lips together into a thin white line. She knew the trajectory of the audit. Trent did not possess my identifying documents, I stated. He had never been inside my apartment. He had no access to my digital footprint. There was only one location on Earth where those specific childhood records were archived. I let the silence hang for 3 grueling seconds. I watched Diane shrink under the invisible weight of her own treason. I pulled the electronic metadata embedded in the LLC formation filings, I explained, my voice dropping to a low, icy register. I ran a geolocation trace on the originating Internet Protocol address. The application was not submitted from Trent's corporate office. It was submitted from the residential router located inside your house in Tampa. Vanessa turned her head slowly, staring at her mother with wide, unblinking eyes. You walked into your own garage, Diane, I said. You opened the fireproof safe hidden under the winter coats. You extracted your own daughter's Social Security card and handed it directly to a desperate man. You actively facilitated the theft of my identity. Diane shook her head in a tight, frantic motion. Mia, she whispered. Her voice was a fragile, breathless rasp. You do not understand. The country club dues, the social standing. We were going to lose everything. I was trying to protect the family image. You were trying to protect a lie, I corrected her. You evaluated the assets at your disposal and decided my freedom and my professional career were acceptable collateral damage. You sold me to fund your mimosas. The architecture of their syndicate was completely exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room. The curated narrative of the absent bitter daughter and the devoted caregiving family lay in ruins. They were not a dynasty. They were a collection of terrified predators who had turned on each other the moment the trap snapped shut. I looked at the 3 of them sitting at the executioner's table. The forensic binder rested open, exposing the depths of their greed. They had nothing left to say. They possessed no leverage, no alibis, and no escape routes. It was time to issue the final, unarguable consequence. It was time to pull the pin and walk away from the wreckage. The silence inside the law office hung suspended, like a physical weight pressing against the mahogany table. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of a structural collapse. The syndicate had entered the room anticipating a coronation. They were now sitting in the wreckage of a federal crime scene. The illusion of the Preston real estate dynasty lay scattered across the polished wood, dissected and cataloged inside my forensic binder. Vanessa was the first to fracture. The pristine facade she had spent years cultivating cracked and peeled away in a matter of seconds. She stared at Trent. The man sitting beside her was no longer the booming commercial developer who promised her an endless stream of coastal properties and country club memberships. He was a terrified debtor. He was a fraud who had financed her designer wardrobe with blood money borrowed from Miami loan sharks. Her posture shifted from proprietary arrogance to raw, visceral panic. The shift was jarring. She recoiled from him, pressing her spine hard against the back of her leather chair. You lied to me, Vanessa said. Her voice started as a breathy whisper and rapidly escalated into a shrill, piercing pitch. You told me the Orlando projects were delayed because of supply chain issues. You told me the cash flow was fine. You stole from Grandma to pay loan sharks. Trent squeezed his eyes shut. He raised a trembling hand, attempting to shush his wife in front of the opposing counsel. Vanessa, please, he muttered, his tone hollow and desperate. Not right now. We can fix this. We just need to manage the narrative. There is no narrative left to manage, Trent Vanessa shrieked, her composure disintegrating entirely. Her hands shook as she gestured toward the blue binder. She has the wire transfers. She has the metadata. You forged her signature. You are going to prison. What happens to me? What happens to the house and the cars? You bankrupted us. She turned on him with the vicious survival instinct of a mercenary realizing the treasury is empty. The unified front they had projected during their relentless gaslighting campaign dissolved into a chaotic, desperate scramble for self-preservation. They were tearing each other apart before the authorities even received the paperwork. The shady attorney sitting at the head of the table recognized the terminal velocity of the situation. A lawyer who prioritizes billable hours also prioritizes his own legal immunity. He did not offer a defense for his clients. He did not attempt to counter my forensic presentation. He simply reached out, gathered his legal pads, snapped his briefcase shut, and stood up. He walked out of the conference room without a single word of parting advice, abandoning the sinking ship to save his own credentials. Diane watched the attorney leave. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing her inside the nightmare. My mother remained frozen in her seat. The extravagant mourning suit she wore felt less like a symbol of high society grief and more like a tailored shroud. Her skin was the color of old ash. She looked at me, her eyes wide and pleading. The arrogant matriarch who had sold my Social Security number to fund her mimosas was gone. She was replaced by a terrified woman, realizing the country club wives she was so desperate to impress were about to read her name in a federal indictment. The social standing she had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was going to become the epicenter of a devastating local scandal. Mia Diane whispered, her voice a fragile, raspy plea. "Please, we are family. You cannot do this. You cannot send this to the authorities. It will destroy us." I did not offer her a sympathetic nod. I did not soften my gaze. "You destroyed yourselves, Diane," I replied, my voice cool and surgical. "You built a trap and walked directly into it. Family is not a shield you get to hide behind after you commit identity theft." The blunt, undeniable truth severed her final hope. Diane slumped forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, useless sobs. Trent watched his alliance crumble. He realized his wife was abandoning him, and his mother-in-law was paralyzed by fear. He was cornered. When a predator runs out of shadows to hide in, it resorts to crude, blind aggression. Trent pushed his chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the carpet. He stood up, planting his hands flat on the mahogany table. He leaned his upper body forward, attempting to utilize his physical size to reclaim the authority he had lost on paper. The lingering panic in his eyes hardened into a desperate, feral malice. "You listen to me," Trent growled, his voice dropping into a guttural threat. "You are not sending that binder anywhere. You are going to take those pages, you are going to shred them, and you are going to walk away. If you try to ruin me, I will drag you down into the dirt with me. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your natural life. I will make sure you never work in a compliance department again. You will burn that ledger, Mia." He was trying to project power, but his hands were trembling against the wood. He was a hollow suit, issuing demands to an empty room. He believed he could still bully his way out of the corner. He assumed I was a passive observer who had simply stumbled upon his secrets. He failed to realize I was the architect of the walls currently closing in on him. I did not flinch away from his looming posture. I did not break eye contact. I let his threat echo into the sterile, chilled air of the law office. I waited until the silence reasserted itself, stripping away the momentum of his anger. "I cannot burn the ledger, Trent," I stated, my tone perfectly level, devoid of any defensive friction. "And I am not going to drag you into a civil courtroom." I reached out and rested my fingertips on the blue vinyl cover of the forensic audit. "You assumed paperwork was just a tedious hurdle you could bypass with a forged signature," I explained, delivering the final lethal sequence of the operation. "You opened a limited liability company to hide the stolen Sarasota property. You submitted the articles of organization to the state registry, and because you needed a scapegoat to absorb the criminal liability, you listed me as the managing member of Clearwater Coastal Holdings." Trent stared at me. His chest heaved. He did not understand the legal trap he had constructed for himself. By listing me as the managing member, you granted me total executive authority over the corporate entity. I continued clarifying the mechanism of his ruin. You gave me full legal jurisdiction over the company assets and its financial ledgers, which means I do not need a subpoena to access the records, and I do not need a judge to grant me permission to report a crime. The realization began to dawn on his pale, sweating face. The color drained away, leaving him looking like a ghost haunting his own life. Because you opened that fraudulent LLC using my identity, I am legally the managing officer, I said, delivering the poetic justice with cold, unarguable precision, which means I have the full fiduciary authority to hand this entire ledger directly to the Internal Revenue Service. You built the exact mechanism of your own federal audit. Trent collapsed backward into his chair. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, jagged exhale. He was out of maneuvers. He was out of leverage. He had engineered an elaborate, sophisticated theft only to hand the remote control for the detonator directly to the auditor he was trying to frame. The execution was complete. The board was cleared. Marcus Sterling stood near the frosted glass panels of the conference room. He had observed the entire exchange with the quiet satisfaction of a litigator watching a flawless strategy unfold. He stepped forward. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and extracted a heavy brass keyring. He slid the keys across the mahogany table. They carried the distinct metallic chime of secured boundaries. They were the keys to the Sarasota beachfront property, the estate my grandfather had built with blistered hands, the legacy Helen and I had protected in the dark. I picked up the keys. The metal felt cold and heavy in my palm. It was the physical weight of victory. I picked up my leather tote bag and secured the thick forensic binder inside. I zipped the compartment shut, locking the evidence away. I stood up from my isolated chair at the far end of the room. I did not offer a dramatic parting monologue. I did not demand apologies from the people weeping and panicking at the table. An apology from a thief is just a negotiation tactic. I simply turned my back on the wreckage. I walked past Diane, who was still sobbing into her hands. I walked past Vanessa, who was staring blankly at the wall, her country club illusions shattered into dust. I walked past Trent, who sat paralyzed in his chair, waiting for the federal authorities to knock on his door. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and walked down the corridor. I stepped into the elevator and rode it down to the lobby. I walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the bright, blinding light of the Florida afternoon. The oppressive heat washed over me, but I felt nothing but a profound, effortless relief. I walked toward my car, leaving my family sitting in a dark, freezing room, left to drown in the shallow, empty grave they had spent 14 months digging for me. That is my story. A forged deed, a stolen identity, and a quiet auditor who refused to let someone else hold her pen. If you are currently sitting at a table where people mistake your silence for weakness, I hope this reminds you of one vital truth. The loudest person in the room is usually the one with the most to hide. And the person with the cleanest paper trail wins the argument before it ever begins. Keep your receipts, protect your signature, and never let them write your ending. Thank you for listening. Drop a comment below if you have ever had to enforce a hard boundary. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.